right, so what were the themes that we focused on in our last lecture? Who can tell me what it is that we were talking about?
So we were talking about the capitalist revolution and why it was made possible. We talked also about its consequences today. For example, climate change, but also some social effects. And that's one chunk of it. I don't want to take it over.
All right, so what is capitalism? How do we define it? Yeah, Isabella.
An economic system where the main institutions are firms, private property, and markets.
Yeah, exactly. So, by private property, what does that afford the owner of that property to do? Really?
To refuse use of it by others and to either give it away or sell it.
Yeah, exactly. And firms and markets have a very important to play in our ability to describe that transition out of stagnation, that flat world as they refer to it in the textbook, which existed as long as we had data, right, for about 1,000 up to 1800. And that's when it really starts to turn up, is the middle of the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution. It was with that Industrial Revolution and the Capitalist Revolution that we started to notice what about inequality? Yeah.
It's more across countries and across regions.
Yeah, so it's not just restricted to within countries, right? When we were down in that flat land, everyone was poor, right? All the countries were poor, basically. So we didn't have that inequality that existed across countries. This is our traveler, Yvonne, who I learned was an actual person. Didn't know that before. I thought it was just a character in the book that they made up, but that's a real person. And he was our traveling scholar that was going throughout Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, I believe. And reporting back to us, like, this is what I noticed, is that the inequality is primarily within country. And there's a couple of personal characteristics that he noted that tended to influence that inequality within country. What were some of those personal characteristics that we talked about? Yeah, so are you born into a wealthy family? But what we see when we look at the data is that, particularly after that industrial and capitalist revolution, is that we start to see some countries take off, right, in terms of their living standards, which here we're using as a proxy for their living standards is GDP per capita. How do we interpret GDP per capita? Yeah, Jeff?
Income of the country per person.
Yeah, so in annual average income, right? GDP we defined as the total income or output of that country. Per capita means we're dividing it by the population. We talked at some length about some of the problems with GDP as an indicator, as a measure, right? Particularly related to the omitted variables. So it doesn't refer to quality of your social life, your physical environment. All kinds of useful caring labor necessary for social reproduction is not counted in that. All of those traditionally feminine activities, not valued by the markets, are not included in that measure. So what is it that allows some of these capitalist countries to do better than others? Really what we see is that we need these economic institutions, the three dominant institutions that we discussed, right? Private property, markets, and firms, to operate effectively. Okay. So we go back to that first slide that I showed you. there's a role for the government. This is true in relation to the performance of these institutions as well, right? So what is the role of the government? What's the role of the government in relation to the performance of some of these dominant institutions we discussed? Yeah.
To regulate them.
Yeah. So they definitely regulate, right? Specifically enforcing contracts. That's a very important part of the private property and markets. Or some other things that the government does that would influence the performance of these institutions. Yeah, Alex.
It provides good infrastructure, good ease of commerce, so we have a good highway system.
Yeah, imagine if it was still all dirt roads, right? Would drastically reduce the performance of the economic system, right? You wouldn't have that mobility of the goods and services. Check.
Also provide sometimes subsidies for local firms and maybe provide tax cuts for those firms.
And so that's one that I don't think we really got into, but the government definitely has the ability to direct economic activity towards the ends that they deem desirable. If we look back in economic history and we look at corporations used to exist to serve the public end. And the earliest examples were canals. Right? We have the most successful canal just about, 30 minutes south of here. The Erie Canal. And it was Vanderbilt and the railroads where we started to see this change in the corporations. No longer is a vehicle to serve public interest, but perhaps to serve the interest of the owners of the capital goods. And this was, in some sense, it was a necessary change, right? As we have this industrial revolution, which is happening at about the same time that railroads are taking off in the U.S., we see this increasing capital intensity in the production process, right? So long-lived, expensive capital goods, oftentimes it would outlive the owners of them. So corporations is one way that we can deal with that. Think about like the railroad tracks are going to last much longer than Vanderbilt did. So he didn't really build much, he just consolidated them. Changed corporate structure, but nonetheless. So I have one other thing that I'm thinking of that the government, actually a few others, but what are some other things that the government does that's important for determining the performance of our economic system?
Inflation and deflation, like controlling.
Okay, so they definitely, through their policies, are able to influence some of these key variables which influence the level of economic activity, right? And in fact, inflation is one of the primary concerns of our monetary policymakers, the Federal Reserve. So they have a dual mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability. By price stability, we mean stable inflation. They target 2%. They haven't been doing such a good job with that recently. And it took a very, very long time after our last crisis for them to get inflation back up around 2%. I think that's right about where we're at now. But for many, many years, they couldn't do anything to get inflation to go up. What are some other things that the government does? Natalie?
We were talking about disposable income, and in disposable income is included taxes and transfers, so the government is responsible for regulating like taxes on like your job, like social, and then Social Security and things like Medicare. Those like transfers in addition.
Yeah, and all of those will in fact impact the performance, right? So taxes will have a direct impact on disposable income. If we look at that most recent tax policy that went through, the tax reform that went through, it's a massive transfer of wealth upwards, exacerbating the inequality that seems to be a problem within our system.
I don't know if this would be considered enforcing contracts, but protecting private and intellectual property rights.
And they're very closely related. Yeah. FDS.
Yeah, I know it's a broad term, but also provide stability to avoid the situations that you have seen, for example, in South America.
Yeah, so definitely post Great Depression, post World War II, we saw a massive increase in the size of the federal government. Right? And this does provide a great degree of economic stability. So again, go back to that very first slide where I said we have these two problems. We have instability, specifically referencing in output, right, or GDP, the measure that we most often use for that, and this tendency towards unemployment, or less than full employment, I think is how I stated it. Right, so we see this massive increase in the size of the federal government. When we look at GDP and its different components later on in this semester, we'll look at the volatility of the different components. Right? So investment is the one that I labeled on that slide as being one of the most volatile. Right? Consumption is another one of those components. It's relatively smooth and stable itself, but as GDP and output's declining, consumption tends to move the same direction. Right? People are losing their jobs, incomes are declining, so you can't buy as much stuff. Right? Government expenditure, on the other hand, tends to move counter-cyclically. So as GDP is dropping off, we're sliding into recession, we typically see government expenditures increasing as a share of GDP. And the easiest example of that is unemployment insurance. People are losing their jobs, GDP is declining, government starts paying out more in those transfer payments, that insurance. Right? So we'll see a rise in their share of GDP. And this provides a great deal of stability. Perhaps one of the reasons we haven't had a crisis like the Great Depression. The last one was pretty severe, but not nearly as severe as 1929 and the decade that followed. I mean, it seriously took a decade for that to end. There was, maybe not officially, but things were very bad for that decade. It's definitely been a slow recovery this time too, but right now it's the longest economic expansion we've ever had. That's been somewhat of a tepid recovery. How about what are we all doing in here? This isn't really necessarily provided by the government, but for many people, same thing that you're doing in here, education. Talk about technology displacing workers. How is it that they gain the skills to get those new jobs that are created by technology? For most people, it's through public education. Healthcare would be another one. Perhaps more so in other countries than here, being provided by the federal government. But so we've talked quite a bit about how these economic outcomes are related to both social and political processes. So what we see is that capitalism can exist within many different political systems. Most often what we see is that it's with democracy, but that's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be so. And the political system will have a direct impact on the performance of those institutions. In fact, that article that we'll discuss this afternoon is directly about that relationship between economics and politics. Do economic outcomes like inequality threaten our political system? I think back to Bolivia, which has had a tumultuous political history. They had more governments being overthrown in a 15, 20-year period than had ever happened anywhere else ever before. A lot of that is related to the poor economic performance.
But also, I'm not exactly sure if this was the Bolivian case as well, but we need to remember that American companies also messed a lot in Latin America. For example, the banana companies.
Oh, yeah.
And they actually organized the overthrows of governments that were democratically elected.
Yeah, and it's somewhat upsetting that I have to simplify down and focus solely on the American experience, because really we are in a global economic system. In fact, just the other day, Emanuel Wallerstein, has anyone heard of that guy? He's a sociologist. He's one of the leading scholars in what they called the world systems theory. Right, so one of the few contributions from sociology that's been widely respected, unfortunately. Oftentimes their work is not as respected as perhaps it should be. But he was one that was able to overcome that and make great contributions. Which we'll actually get to part of the reason we have to do this next class, next week, the simplifications that are necessary. Right? And when are those assumptions, the assumption that we refer to as ceteris paribus, right? Holding other things constant, and when is that appropriate, when should it be relaxed? Start thinking critically about some of these assumptions that we're making as we progress through the semester. All right, so what is economics? The end of our first mod here. I haven't even given you this definition yet. So why don't you take a minute and jot down in your notes what you think economics is. And we'll come back to this later in the semester and revisit what it is you think and how it's changed. As you write down your final thoughts, why don't you find a neighbor you haven't spoken with yet, introduce yourself, see if you can't combine and come up with an idea of what economics is that you both agree on.
That's the study of markets and global systems.
The study of how interaction make decisions to allocate
Just a second, I need to write that.
Unlimited
Supply, right? So if there's no demand, then
That's like
not
normal
many skips.
stuff. Like I was trying to
Yes, in a sense. So I was going to look at other things. Without looking at
My definition is that
But there's something that
there is a way or a system of
so there's some things that are already finite amounts of.
not with a whole lot of
money,
more
natural resources, and other resources within a country or other political
It kind of caused the problem in the first place, but not.
But it could also be the solution to the problem. That's just something to think about. There's no right answer. Most of the time, it's all about the choices.
To global allocation, study marketing classes for labor and
I don't think that the economics is right I think the word system is
I'm interested in how that impacts
I mean, it depends. You have economy of a single company or economy of a single household. Like households also have economics. If you think about it, your household can gather, plastic glass bottles and cans and get money back from it. You can, I don't know, even have a small garden in your yard so you don't spend additional money for fresh produce. And other households can just do, other households may not care about it, therefore they annually spend a lot more money. And at the same time, there is a global economy because when one country or one company, because right now sometimes we need to put companies in countries as equals. Some companies are just so huge. So when one country or company is getting richer, another country or company is poorer. So, and it's important to know that the global economy also things will be lower. Everything affects the global economy in wider or in bigger or smaller degree. Yeah, but if you think about it, instead of one household, 1 million households will collect bottles and put them into the machines that pay you your money back. Then it affects in various ways. So it also affects the recycling prices. Maybe the price of plastic and glass will go lower because of that. Oh yeah. Oh no, certainly it does. Yeah. I mean, even if put a glass bottle into recycling, it does affect the business because there is ready glass or ready plastic just to just to reuse. It goes to this special. It's not factory. It's an industrial center. The glass is melted and shaped into a new bottle or jar or whatever. same goes with plastic. Similar thing is with paper. No new trees have to be cut down, which of course affects the environment, but also you don't have to pay the lumberjack. You don't have to pay all the other people that turn the piece of wood into paper. So yeah. And the recycle centers are
Does anyone want to share their definition with the class?
automatic in a last degree.
All right, let's bring it back up here. Did you volunteer to share?
Yeah.
Okay, you can argue with it too now.
We actually combined our definitions. So mine is now the study of markets and global systems for labor and allocation of scarce resources.
Okay, so say that one more time.
The study of markets and global systems for labor and allocation of scarce resources.
So markets go back. How far back do you think markets go?
Time.
Yeah, from the to the very beginning of the humankind. But depends about which markets are we talking about, because the cavemen were trading bones for fur or meat.
Okay, but does exchange constitute a market?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like maybe not a legit one. But
So like when you give a gift to someone, is that a market?
No,
No,
because
because it's not
that's-
reciprocated.
But they're going to reciprocate that gift back. Right?
No.
Not necessarily.
well, like if you bought from the place, is that the
I mean, but like.
The earliest forms of exchange were actually related to gift giving. Right. I think some of the earliest markets go back to these early fairs that were used to settle debts. And it's not back to the origins of mankind that we have markets. Where people were living in caves, and I don't think there were markets back then.
like not physically, but
I feel like
Organized society.
it depends on how you define markets.
I have to go back to our slides. Who has their notes on them? How do we define markets?
Services from one person to another.
Say that again?
Yeah, are means of transferring goods or services from one person to another for mutual benefit.
Sounds like a kid.
are means of transferring goods or services from one person to another.
So transferring goods and services for mutual benefit. Yeah. When is that? Yeah, I'll find it. I have it written down somewhere how far back markets go. Anthropology has the answer. Economics does. We would tend to assume that markets, like you're saying, right, they go back to the earliest traces of mankind. But anthropologists would disagree with that. Okay, so here's what our textbook says, which I think many of you actually have this definition. This is interaction between people, their natural surroundings, producing their livelihoods, and how this changes over time. So, some of which you had mentioned is a part of that. Right? Scarcity is not a part of this statement.
not necessarily not from Greek.
One of the things that's different about this definition from a lot of the other ones is that change over time. Right? So if we look at most other textbooks, it's going to straight up say economics is the study of choice. Right? They dropped the scarcity part from their definition now. Okay? It used to be the study of the allocation of resources or allocation under scarce resource, something along those lines. Back in 1933 or 34, Lionel Robbins wrote an article where he came up with that definition about choice and scarcity. And it wasn't debated at all. 20, 30, 40 years later, it shows up in the textbooks. This is what economics is. Choice and scarcity. And since that time, it's dropped the scarcity. Now it's just all about choice. Which is, and that's part of this, right? It's part of this definition, I think. But it's definitely not the focus of it. Right. Scarcity is another one. We were arguing about that earlier too, right? Scarcity, this natural phenomena. I argued that it was technologically created. kind of went back and forth on that one as well. There's a good book, The Economics of Abundance, that discusses that, the artificial scarcity. So, any questions about what is economics? So, in this first unit, really what we've tried to do is introduce you into this use of visual graphics, of information, of these measures, try to convey information. This is one of the learning outcomes that the department and college has agreed upon. You should be able to use these visual images to convey information. It's a part of your argument. Okay. We talked about inequality quite a bit. It's a theme that's going to recur again and again. Okay, we saw this hockey stick trend in GDP. We talked about some of the negative consequences that it has, perhaps on the environment, distributional aspects. That hockey stick growth in GDP per capita was the result of those technological revolution, the industrial revolution. It wasn't possible to produce that much before the industrial revolution, this technological revolution came about. Right? Closely associated with that is that capitalist revolution. Right? The two definitely interacted with each other. There's some feedback processes at play there. Capitalism created those incentives to adopt those new technologies, and so definitely facilitated that process. We defined capitalism according to those key institutions, those dominant institutions, private property, particularly of capital goods, right? Markets where we acquire our inputs and where we dispose of our outputs, and firms where production takes place. Right? It's an interesting concept, the firm, because it's also the stage where interactions occur between people, right? Not just where things are produced. Right? The dominant way firms are organized now is the corporation. So there's all kinds of interesting things associated with that. Right? Corporations as people, something that's perhaps controversial. Talked about how these institutions and whether they operate effectively or not impact economic growth. And this relationship between political systems and economic outcomes, which is closely related to this article that we'll look at this afternoon as well. Back. One thing I really like about this definition is that it's broad, right? If you're interested in environmental stuff, it's right here in that as well, very clearly stated. If you're interested in caring labor, okay, stuff that's necessary for social reproduction, that's in that definition. This interaction between firms and households, right? So particularly this one right here, something that I've been very interested in, employment outcomes, labor market outcomes, and employment policy. Again, right? The economy is very much about these social relationships, which are occurring within the larger biosphere, all of which exist in that physical environment. And it's all interconnected. One cannot exist without the other. Well, at least the economy can't exist without the biosphere and the physical environment. So, what we'll do when we get into Unit 2 next week is we'll introduce the economic models for the first time in this class, talk about the modeling process, how to evaluate economic models. This is really going to set us up moving forward. Because once we get through Mod 1, we're going to start developing an economic model of the national economy, right? Paying particular attention to the determination of, who recalls what those three things were that I said I'm going to put on that final.
Which one is input and output?
Employment, output, and prices.
Yeah. So what, and not only what determines them, but what causes those fluctuations as well. Output, remember we talked about GDP, employment, we typically use the unemployment rate as a measure, and prices, we're talking about the inflation rate. And we'll get into much more detail with all three of those as we progress through the semester. The first model that we'll introduce, we're going to go back into the history of economics and draw from Malthus. Back in the 1800s, second half, maybe middle of it, 1800s, something like that. His model focuses on the interaction between population, technology, and economic growth. You may have heard of it before, somewhat pessimistic. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah. Is that Thomas Malthus?
Yeah.
Oh, that guy.
Yeah. That guy. He was actually influential in his own way. Keynes had read him and was influenced by him as well. Right? The possibility of gluts existing was definitely influential in Keynes. And Keynes is often referred to as, like Smith is the father of economics, Keynes is the father of macroeconomics. Because of Keynes' writing in 1936, his General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, that we had this divide in economics, the micro and macro. Before that, there wasn't. It was political economy in the 1800s, economics after that, and then it split into micro and macro. Keynes really revolutionized it and said, these tools that you're using about studying individuals is not sufficient to understand the performance of national economies. You can't simply aggregate up and understand the dynamics that exist. Now, so it made sense back in the 1930s because we didn't have the tools to understand these different phenomena. So we had this divide. One thing you'll notice about this textbook, those terms don't show up anywhere. There's no micro, macro divide in this textbook. Part of the reason is that the authors believe that we now have the tools, no longer have to have this divide. Okay. So one last slide here I want to talk about. So this was created by Pavlina Chernova. Right, she's an economist just down the Hudson River a little ways, associated with the Levy Institute at Bard College. She used Piketty and Saez along with some stuff from NBER. Anyone heard of Thomas Piketty? Wrote a book a couple of years back, became quite popular. French economist. Capital. He made it onto the New York Times bestseller. It's a big, thick book. No one's heard of it? All right, well, anyways, what I want you to do is to tell me what information does this graph convey to us? So again, I'll give you a minute or so, think about it by yourself, and then to pair up with someone different from your last conversation. So what is this image telling us? All right, I want you to think about what variables we're using, right, as well as to discuss any patterns or trends that you see. If you have any insight into historical events that may have attributed to these, go ahead and include that into your conversation.
How is it possible that the bottom 9% have actually a negative percentage?
That's a good question. Think about what is it that we're measuring here. And then Get a little more time to think about this, then I'll have you get into small groups and discuss it. All right, do you all feel comfortable getting into groups to discuss what's going on here? Yeah, okay, so pick someone different than last time. Introduce yourself if you don't know them.
Well, I see like income and the inequality between average and
So I guess the bottom 90%, their salaries are going down.
That's what it reminds me of. It's like interesting. Like just like a huge gap. Because like I didn't really expect like such a big gap with like the top 10% and the 90% from like 1929, like on the left hand side to like the right hand side is such a big difference. Yeah, and like that, like I don't know. I'm not really. I guess I'm not surprised that like the fact that like just the top 10% like there's so much over the last like since like of the percentage.
Right above what, like how much salary you're getting?
I just like wondering is that like growing, like their income growing, or like their average
We're making the pie bigger. We're talking about
I think we were just talking about it like a slice of the pie, and like getting slices of the pie. Yeah, and just like I guess, like how much of the pie they're getting. It's just interesting, like how it I also wonder how much money has to have to be in the top 10%? Like, what is that top? Like, is that like just like nice upper middle class and then like stupid amount of money?
What happened in that last decade or that last period is not just that you didn't get any of your economy the pie became larger, but now it's piece we have Units 5, I think, they talk about fairness. Pretty sure it's that's what they're
The fourth and third on the right go against each other.
Even if you get a it's still
Because from eating yeah, top 10% goes down.
What happened was I mean, that's what I was assuming it is.
So it's definitely the rate of
Yeah.
So then since there's a lot less access to regulated, like that's probably, since there's less tax on this, growth is yeah, okay, capital. There's something like that's one of it.
So the aim of the change of policy making is that acceleration of such a good job to find some historical evidence there. What's the confusion?
So I'm not really sure how mapping that. So I'm not sure
Seem a little bit.
because I think of yeah.
Okay, now I'm holding on to this one. I don't want to describe it.
So what we're measuring here is the top 10% versus the bottom 10%. Increases in income. We have this pie that's this large. The top 10% versus the bottom 10%. How much they get. So what does it mean when you get 120%?
It's hard.
Your deck is written down in styles, and you're aggregating the bottom line. Not bad, and you have a team actually increases.
I don't think I
I know, it sucks.
okay, you know, like, I'm kind of like
Okay, who can tell me what this graph is telling us?
Yeah, that's like not.
Yeah.
I was actually
It's telling us that,
like my throughout time.
Hang on one second. Hey everyone, let's come back up here. All right, go for it.
it's telling us like throughout time, like at the bottom, 90% like a decreased share of average income growth and actually made a negative percentage. Yeah. Whereas the top 10% have gained much more income growth.
Yeah, how do you make negative income unless you're like unemployed?
Okay, one person.
So technically they're like losing income growth.
Their income is
Yeah.
No, they're just measuring.
Yeah, they're getting less money.
So pay attention to what variables we're talking about, right? Talking about shares of growth and income. So we have a pie, the pie is becoming larger. Who's getting that addition to the pie? Okay. you'll notice that it adds to 100% over time, right? Every different period adds to 100%. Right, so we're saying, okay, the pie increased by this much, this group's getting that much, this group is getting that much. That's what these bars are representing. So what does it mean to have a negative share of that increase in the income? Yeah. Yeah.
It means that the income actually decreases for this group when compared to the previous years.
Yeah, so not only are you not getting that extra pie that we just made, but you're getting less than you got last period. Yeah, Claire.
It also means that the top 10% has gained what the top 90% had.
Has lost. Yeah. So we see this decreasing trend for the share of income going to the bottom 90%, increasing share going to the top 10%. Yeah, there's some fluctuations. It kind of dips down, but overall the trend across this range, across the observations that we have, is an upward trend. Right. What else can you tell me about that trend?
It accelerated in the 1982 to the 90 section.
Yeah, so in the 1980s, it really turns upward at a quicker rate, right? So it's increasing at an increasing rate after 1980. Yes.
We don't really see before 1949, but it seems like the top 10% are having even more of income growth.
Yeah, so what happened is the start of this data that we have here, the late 40s, early 50s, was a period when inequality was at just about the lowest we've seen, right, in a long time at the very least. Right, so then we start to see a reversal in that trend from that point forward. So that's why they start at that point, because that's when the trend takes off.
Of course, even back then, it seemed like the top 10% were still getting 20% of the growth rather than 10% of the what they should be.
Yeah.
Or is this like, okay, never mind, actually that top 10%, that's actually, okay.
What do you mean by fair?
Because if you have the highest salary, then it makes sense that you get more growth.
Well, I mean, that's, yeah. Economics, I was just having this discussion over here, right? Economics claims to be value-free science. Right? So we oftentimes don't want to say, oh, that's fair or not fair. That's for the sociologists and the anthropologists to talk about.
If I'd say it was fair, I said it was more fair.
Even that is a value statement. Right? Economists, I don't know if we'll actually get to this or not, but I'll throw it out there. So economists like to base their policy prescriptions off of what's called the Pareto principle. Right? And basically what that means is if I can say that at least one person is made better off without anyone else being made worse off, as an economist, I say, yeah, you should do that. Now, it doesn't matter if I can make 1 million people better off and one person worse off. If I'm adhering to that Pareto principle, I'm going to say, no. Probably shouldn't do that. Whereas if I'm concerned with fairness, I might be like, oh yeah, you should definitely do that. It might be well worth it to harm that one person, right, to make them worse off, if we can make that many people better off. So it questions whether or not we should be a value-free science or not. So there is a discussion of this in the textbook. So I think it was Unit 5, but you can find it in there. So what else do you see here? Yeah.
Like in 1991 to 2000, the gap was a little bit better. I think there's a recession at that time.
So there was an expansion. So that's the other thing we could talk about is how are we breaking these periods apart? Okay. And so you'll see that up in the top, they do it according to expansions or to the business cycle. So each of those periods represents one business cycle. We're talking about going from trial to peak. Okay, so 1991 to 2000 was an expansion that terminated with the dot-com bubble in 2001. Right, 2001 to 2007 was the housing market bubble, culminating in the Great Recession, Great Financial Crisis. Right. And then the data is a little bit old, the image is a little bit old, but yeah, 2009 until present is the current expansion that we're in. How does this relate to the article that I had you read? So why don't we take a quick break and then we'll turn our discussion to the article. Yeah? 5 minutes?